Try and use all your fingers this time. Okay, let us pray. Lord Jesus Christ, meet with us afresh this day. Open our minds to see you. Open our ears to hear you. Open our hearts to love you. And open our minds to know you, that we may glimpse more of your glory and that our lives may be lived in harmony with you and with your word. Father, we pray for those on our church list we've just been mentioning, our family and friends, those who need your special help and your grace and your mercy at this particular time. For those who are ill, for those who are bereaved, for those who are recovering, we ask for your help. Father, now give us the promised teaching ministry of the Holy Spirit as we turn to your word and as we continue our studies in Matthew's Gospel. Help us, bless us, and inspire us and uplift us, for we ask for your help in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we're going to turn to Matthew 20, the last verses of Matthew 20. If you're following in the Pew Bibles, it's at page 1535. 1535 in the Pew Bibles. 1535. And we're going to pick it up as Jesus is arriving at Jericho. Let me just read you the first part of this, and then we'll look at it together. So, Matthew 20, from verse 29 to verse 34. And as I say, if you're looking at it in the Pew Bibles, 1535. As Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. Two blind men were sitting by the roadside. When they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." The crowd rebuked them and told them to be quiet. But they shouted all the louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." Jesus stopped and called them. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. "Lord," they answered, "we want our sight." Jesus had compassion on them, touched their eyes immediately, and they received their sight and followed him. Now, I wonder what your views are on, you will find different stories in the Gospels, but they have small or perhaps significant differences in the story. And I wonder how you feel about that. I wonder, does it either weaken your confidence in the accuracy of the Bible, or does it strengthen your confidence in the accuracy of the Bible? Let me suggest to you that it ought to strengthen. And I'm not talking about significant differences, but I'm talking about, as we'll see as we plunge into this, we'll see that some of the other Gospels give slightly different facts attributed to this blind man at Jericho. Now, an important point to mention to you, this is not the Jericho of the south. It's not the Jericho down south of Jerusalem. It is a smaller town, Jericho, to the north of Jerusalem. So remember that Jesus is coming down from Galilee, from Nazareth, Capernaum, and so on, from that area which is up north. He's traveling south. He's going to Jerusalem, and he comes to the town of Jericho. It's not the Jericho where the walls came tumbling down, which is south. Just say that so that you get it in your mind. Now, the reason I ask you that question about your confidence in the accuracy and reliability of the Bible is that Matthew is the only person who mentions two blind men. But he doesn't name either one. However, we know from Mark that one of them was Bartimaeus. And Luke doesn't mention the name of anyone, but he also only mentions one. So you have Matthew talking about two blind men. You have Luke talking about one blind man here in Jericho. And you have Mark telling us that his name, he again only mentions one. And he tells us that his name is Bartimaeus. Now, I want to suggest to you, as I say, that this really should build your confidence because they're not copying off one another. Each gospel writer is drawing his sources, and he's writing down what he has been told. He's talking to eyewitnesses. An eyewitness testimony, if you've ever looked at any kind of investigation or police or a case, you will know that if the police get 5 eyewitnesses, you're going to get 5 very different accounts of a bank robbery or a car accident or something. People see things differently, and some people see something in the incident which other people don't see. So it should, if they were identical, you would be suspicious. It's amazing how many times in school my homework was identical to the boy next door to me. So there had to be some kind of reason for that. Unfortunately, he wasn't any brighter than I was. But anyway. Now, in Luke's gospel, he follows it up by telling us about Zacchaeus. He recounts 2 incidents. He recounts the healing the blind man and giving him back his sight, and it recounts the better-known tax collector Zacchaeus. Do you remember? Tax collector Zacchaeus is a little small guy, and he climbs up into the tree, he sees where Jesus is going. He's taking the road out of Jericho. Jesus will never visit Jericho again. This is his last time going through its streets. And he runs ahead of Jesus, and he can't get through the mob, so he climbs up into a tree. And Jesus sees him up there amongst the leaves, and he calls him down, and he transforms and changes his life. So Luke gives us that account too, as well as the healing of a blind man. And as I say, the gospel writers put down what they have drawn from their sources. Now, here's an interesting and intriguing thing. What was Matthew before he became a follower of Jesus? His name was Levi. We meet him in Matthew 11. What was his occupation? Anybody remember? He was a tax collector. What was Zacchaeus? He was a tax collector. Now, it's kind of odd. You would think then that Matthew would remember, because he was an eyewitness. Remember, Matthew at this point is with the rest of the disciples, accompanying Jesus. He sees these things firsthand. And it's funny that he doesn't remember Zacchaeus. When he's writing all of this down, maybe he thinks, well, Luke's already put that down there, but that doesn't really work because we believe Matthew was the second gospel to be written. Remember, Mark was the first, then Matthew we believe is the second, then Luke comes third, and then John a good deal later. So you have to say to yourself, well, why does Matthew not remember a fellow tax collector having his life changed and transformed as Matthew's own life was changed? But he doesn't record it. And sometimes it has been known for us to forget some things. And somebody prompts you. Somebody says to you, oh, do you remember that was, a husband or wife, or somebody will say, oh, that was the trip
in which we went to such and such, and that has completely gone out of your mind. You go, oh yeah, that was the same time. But up to that point, you had forgotten it. So Matthew clearly did not remember the Zacchaeus thing, otherwise he might have slipped it into his gospel here. He seems to have forgotten it. But here are two men, and as I say, Matthew doesn't have at his fingertips the name of either man, and Jesus heals them. And you notice what they cry out, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. What you've got to understand, and we'll see it just in a few verses further on, Son of David was very much a nationalistic cry amongst the Jews. It was saying we need to be free. We need our own king. Let's get rid of these Romans. We need our autonomy and our freedom. And Son of David was a rallying cry for a throwback and a desire for the golden days of monarchy, when we had our own king, when the kingdom, under David, the kingdom was at its largest because of David's ability as a warrior, because he won battles. And when you won battles, you won land, you won territory. And so the kingdom was at its largest under David because of conquest. Later on, the kingdom was at its largest under his son Solomon because he made alliances and deals with other nations. Now, the downside of it was he had to marry one of the daughters of one of the tribal kings that he made a pact with, which is how he ended up with so many wives. But as part of that whole deal, you got part of their land, and so your kingdom got larger. So under Solomon, the kingdom was as large as it ever became. And then, of course, after the fall of the United Kingdom, under Solomon's son, it all fell apart and split into two nations. Now, they come then to Bethpage. Pick it up at verse 1 of chapter 21. As they approached Jerusalem, they came to Bethpage on the Mount of Olives. Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, tell them that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to your daughter of Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Let's just stop at that point. Now again, here's one of these differences. Matthew is the only gospel writer who mentions, they all give you an account of what has become known to us as Palm Sunday, Jesus' triumphal entry into the city of Jerusalem. Matthew is the only gospel writer who mentions 2 animals, the donkey and the colt. And what it's telling us is that the colt was so young, it had not been weaned from its mother. Now that strengthens the details that the colt was so young that it had never, ever been ridden before. Jesus was the first person to sit on this little animal's back. So it hadn't been trained, it hadn't been broken, it hadn't been used to people riding on it. You know, this story and the fact that Jesus was able to control this animal through the cheering throng of people in Jerusalem, all these pilgrims yelling and throwing palm branches at their feet and throwing their cloaks at the feet of Jesus and yelling at the top of their voices. This whole incident was what persuaded a well-known Victorian jockey called Archer to become a Christian.
He said if Jesus could do this, if Jesus could control this unbroken animal and ride it into the city with calmness and quietness, then he must truly be the Son of God. And Archer became a Christian based on his personal experience of riding horses and knowing how unpredictable horses are, that it persuaded him that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. So, again, Matthew is the only one who mentions that there's a donkey and there's a colt. The others just mention a colt or a donkey. Now, remember, Matthew is the gospel of the king. Jesus is the King of the Jews. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the one for whom the Jews have waited and prayed and hoped for centuries. And Matthew is careful to link up the Old Testament prophecies of what the Messiah will do with what Jesus is doing. And you see, if you look at verse 5 of the chapter, there's the quote from Zechariah. Say to the daughter of Zion, see your king comes to you gentle and riding on a donkey. And then the second bit, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So Matthew is linking in. He's actually linking in two verses. One is Isaiah 62 and verse 11. And the other is the better known Zechariah 9 and 9. When we get to Palm Sunday, you will find in the bulletin, or you'll find from the liturgist or something, there will be the words of this prophecy. We always use them on Palm Sunday. It's the only Sunday that we can use them on. This whole business of the king coming riding in gentleness and peace on a donkey. So Matthew is careful to relate these things. And again, we'll see Son of David was recognized as a messianic title. It was a little war cry to the nation. It was a reminder that they were not free, that they were an occupied nation. We'll see it a few verses further on. At this point in Luke's gospel, Luke 19:28, the Pharisees call on Jesus to silence his disciples because they're calling out this Son of David. And the problem was that there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in Jerusalem for the Passover. The Passover was, if you were going to go to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews, you were going to go to the Passover. It was a week-long festival. The city was crammed with people. And people came not only from all over the country, but they came from all over the Mediterranean region to be at Jerusalem for the Passover, the oldest festival of the Jews, the oldest religious symbolism of the Jews. It was there. And if you were going to go for anything, you were going to go for that. And the problem was that this made Jerusalem a powder keg. There were too many people in the city. There was a feeling that, that the Roman soldiers could not control the numbers. They could have overwhelmed. I mean, every Roman governor brought in extra troops to deal with the great mob during Passover. But even bringing in extra troops, you would be outnumbered 100 to 1 by the Jewish population. And we know that people traveled, if you think about Jesus going to Jerusalem when he was 12. People traveled together as either families or as communities. A village would travel together. They would go around the village and say, okay, who's going this year to the Passover? And certain families would say, yes, we're going, and so on. They'd all travel together. They traveled together for safety. They traveled together for friendship and fellowship, and round the campfire at night, they could talk and chat and so on. That was what they did. So great numbers of people went to Jerusalem. And those in the north were perhaps the strongest, the most nationalistic group. They longed to get rid of the Romans. If there was going to be a problem arising, it was going to arise in the north. It was going to break out in Galilee or Nazareth or Capernaum, and the problem would sweep down. So the whole city was a powder keg, and the Pharisees were afraid that this yelling out of David, son of David, would suddenly incite the crowd, and the crowd would turn into a mob. Remember what Benjamin Franklin said, a crowd has so many heads with not a brain amongst them. That was Franklin's view. And the Pharisees are afraid of trouble. They're afraid there's going to be trouble. Now look down at verse 10. After crying out, Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, who is this? Now, that's hard for us to imagine because we live in a very visual age. You know people from television. You know people because they're photographed, their lifestyle has been in magazines, has been in books, has been on the television, has been on Facebook, and so on. We live in a visual age. You may not remember a celebrity's name, but you remember their face. You know, they're familiar. This was not that. This is, of course, long before all of these things. And so the people who lived in Jerusalem, there are going to be hundreds of people in Jerusalem who had no idea who Jesus was, who never saw him before, who didn't recognize him. And so they say, now who are they addressing who is this? They're asking the pilgrims. They're asking the people from up north. And they very proudly say, look at verse 11, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. They're very proud of this. Jesus is the hometown hero. He's from our town. He's from our area. I'm related to his family and stuff like that. They're very eager to tell the somewhat snooty Jerusalemites that they know who this is. That, don't you know? This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth. Haven't you heard the stories about this man? Haven't you heard about his miracles? And so on. You can see them being eager to tell the story and reassure them who this Jesus is. Now, before we get into the temple section, let me say a little bit about the temple, because you kind of got to, this will be helpful, I hope. The original temple, which David wanted to build, and God said, no, you have blood on your hands, your son Solomon will build the temple. Remember that all of the Ark of the Covenant and everything had dwelt in the tabernacle. The tabernacle was the tented place of worship. And it was always at the center of the community. Remember, on the journey from Egypt, it was always placed first in the camp. When you camped for the night or for the week, it was placed first, and then everyone else lined up according to the tribes around it. But they wanted to build a permanent structure. They wanted to build a temple. David wanted it above all. He wanted to bring the ark back and put it in a glorious building. But God said no. So Solomon built the temple. And the details of the temple are given in chapter after chapter after chapter. I mean, in endless detail. What the hinges on the doors were like. Everything, every detail, what wood they used in the temple, the cedars of Lebanon, and so on. So Solomon builds the temple, and there was no expense spared. They spent what would be the equivalent of millions on it. And it was one of the wonders of the ancient world. People in the ancient world went to the temple in Jerusalem. They went to the lighthouse at Alexandria in Egypt. They went to the library in Alexandria, which was the largest library in the world. Obviously, they hadn't seen mine, but it was one of the ancient wonders of the world. Now, this glorious, beautiful temple was destroyed in 586 when the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem and carried people off into exile. If you read Daniel chapter 1, it's the story of Daniel's first encounter, how as a teenager he's taken off to Babylon. So it's the beautiful temple, the glorious temple, Solomon's temple as it was called, was destroyed in 586. And when they came back from exile out of Babylon, they rebuilt the temple. Now, it was a pale imitation of the original. It was much smaller. It was on a much less grand scale because they didn't have the money. They didn't have the gold and the silver and everything that Solomon had to pour into the temple. By the way, if you're looking at the Old Testament books, you may recall that the book of Nehemiah is about rebuilding the city. The book of Ezra is about rebuilding the temple and reestablishing the worship in the temple, having come back out of Babylon. That's how you distinguish between those two books. And that rebuilt, smaller version, less impressive version, lasted for 500 years. Now, 21 years before Jesus, the guy we know as Herod the Great, who was not a Jew, remember, he had been placed on the throne of Israel by the Romans. He was a puppet king, but he was a very brutal tyrant. But he wanted to ingratiate himself with the Jews. And he thought to himself, what can I do that will put a lot of the Jews on my side, make them think well of me? And he said, what do they love most? They love the temple of God. And so he spent a lot of his money and a lot of public money on restoring the temple. Now, this restoration was still going on during Jesus' life, but it began 21 years before Jesus was born. So it was a big project. And it was still going on, and they were going to restore parts of the temple. And it's to this temple, what became known as Herod's temple, that Jesus and the disciples arrive. Let's pick it up there at 12. Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers. The blind and the lame, well, we'll stop at that point, about you're making it a place of robbers. Now, the temple had different courts. The outer court was called the court of the Gentiles. And it was to that area where the stall holders set up their stalls. And the court of the Gentiles, to the Jews, God had intended the court of the Gentiles to be an introduction to non-Jewish nations to learn about Jehovah God. That was God's intention. The Jews just used it, it's just a thoroughfare into the real parts of the temple. They had no respect for it, no regard for it, and it didn't matter to them. They never saw God's intention in it. They couldn't imagine why God would be interested in any non-Jewish nation. It was just crazy in their view. So they had no respect for it. And so in this outer court, there were the money changers and the people who sold you the birds and the animals that you could offer as a sacrifice. And so when you came to Jerusalem as a foreign pilgrim from Rome or from Greece or from wherever, you came with your own coinage jingling in your pocket. And that wasn't acceptable in the temple, so you had to change it. If you've gone to Europe in the past, say more than, let's say, 20 years ago, you know that if you were going to go to a bunch of countries in Europe, you would have to have French francs. Then you would have to have British pounds. Then you might need Italian lira. You might need German marks. And you might need Irish punts. Well, when they all went into the EEC, they all went on what? The euro. And so you could use the same coins, the same notes, whether you were in Italy, whether you were in France, whether you were in Germany, whether you were in Belgium, whether you were in Switzerland, wherever you were. If you were in an EEC country, the euro was accepted everywhere. But these money changers were the authorized temple dealers. And every year, if you were a male Jew, and you were living, didn't matter whether you were living in Rome or whether you were living in Galilee, you were charged with a temple tax of half a shekel a year. So you had to change your money to give the half a shekel to pay your temple tax. If you wanted to make a sacrifice, you might want to buy doves or a lamb or sheep. They had to be pure, they had to be acceptable, they had to be legitimate and authorized. Now, what we know is that if you changed your money, you were going to pay about 6% over the odds to exchange your coins. If you were going to buy a dove inside the temple, and the doves were live, of course, they were kept in baskets and so on. If you wanted to buy a dove, that dove would cost you 5 times what it would cost you outside the temple. But it was an authorized dove. It was a dove which was considered pure and so on. So inside the temple, inside this outer courtyard, these precincts were the authorized traders. They were approved by the chief priests. We might think of them as franchise. If you want to open a KFC, you want to open a Burger King, you've got to apply to them. They authorize, you get the franchise, you buy all the raw materials from them. It's all part of the deal. And you sell your product based on the fact that you're KFC or you're Burger King or McDonald's or whatever. Now, as I say, the outer court was the court of the Gentiles, and everyone was welcome there. That was the whole point, that foreign nations, Gentile nations, could come and could see the first part of this temple and be impressed and be able to ask questions and understand a bit more of what God was like. Now, there were warnings on doors and on gateways that if you were not a Jew, you couldn't go any further. It was on pain of death. You couldn't go beyond that. Now, imagine coming into this outer courtyard, and you have all the smells and the sounds of a cattle market, with the cries of the traders and the money changers and so on. And here's the thing, people have a very one-dimensional view of Jesus. They have a sort of Disney-ish view of Jesus, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, wouldn't hurt a fly. But here you see the anger of Jesus. Here you see the indignation of Jesus. And he's not at all reluctant to display it, because he's angry at what they're doing to what he considers his Father's house. Now, in the Gospels, you will find 2 accounts of Jesus casting out the money changers and cleansing the temple. At the beginning of his ministry, on his first ministry visit to Jerusalem, and then this is the end visit. And this is the last week of Jesus' life. So he enters, verse 12, entered the temple area and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. You can see can't you see the image? You know, some of the doves getting free and flying up. The coins, he overturns the tables and coins go here and there, and the traders scrabbling after them, and little kids going, oh, there's a silver coin, and grabbing at it. It's a whole scene. It's a whole image. And he says, it is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers. So Jesus has no reluctance in showing his anger, showing his displeasure. And it's righteous anger. We see in a few moments, in one verse, you go from the angry Jesus to the compassionate Jesus. The Jesus who then sits down in this temple area. Look at verse 14. The blind and the lame came to him at the temple and he healed them. So you can see this parade of people. Now, obviously, some people knew that Jesus was in the city. Remember, the question a few minutes ago was, who is this? Now, Jesus had healed people on other previous visits to Jerusalem. John, for instance, in John chapter 5, tells about healing the man at the pool of Bethesda. And word had spread. If you were a person who was paralyzed, if you were blind, if you were lame, if you were deaf, the word reached you that if this Jesus of Nazareth comes to the city, you need to make every effort to get yourself before him, because he will help you. He's willing to help you. He has the power to help you. And so the jungle drums had beaten, and verse 14, the blind and the lame came to him at the temple. The word had gone out. Jesus of Nazareth is back in the city. And they came to him to be healed. Now, on one hand, you have the adoration of those who need help. And in the next verse, you have the criticism of those who don't realize how much help they need. You have the scribes and the Pharisees and the chief priests. And they heard the children, in this part, having come into the city, having gone to the temple, the children are shouting out, Hosanna, son of David, and they were indignant. Look at what they say, verse 16. Do you hear what these children are saying? They asked Jesus. Yes, he replied. Have you never heard that from the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise? Jesus is quoting there from the Psalms. And so the children are yelling out. The children have taken up this cry. And Jesus is confronting the religious leaders. That Hosanna to the Son of David was even a cry of the children. It was a nationalistic cry. It was something that they meant a great deal, touched the hearts of Jews. How many of you like the movie Casablanca? Okay. If you've ever watched Casablanca, the movie, there's a scene in Rick's Cafe, and Randy Eisendorf can actually quote this word for word. He's a bit of a Casablanca aficionado. But there's a scene in Rick's Cafe where the Germans are starting to sing very patriotic German nationalistic songs. And the orchestra leader looks to Rick, and Rick gives him the permission, and they strike up. What do they strike up, Irene? The Marseillaise. And so they begin to sing the French anthem. And each group tries to outsing the other, get louder and louder and louder, and there's almost a riot situation. Well, this is the kind of thing, this is what this Hosanna, Son of David, evokes in the fiercely proud nationalistic Jews. It's a desire for them to have their own king. No king. All we have are these Romans. And of course, again, the religious leaders are worried that this will lead to a riot situation and so on. And it's a very emotive image of Jesus there in the temple precincts, the gratitude of the people who've been healed, the criticism of the Pharisees and the chief priests and the religious leaders, all coming on Jesus and so on. It's wonderful. Verse 17 brings it down to earth and down to ordinary things. What does it say? And he left them and went out to the city of Bethany, where he spent the night. Now, you can see that this is, he's going to the home of Lazarus and Mary and Martha. He's going for a last visit. Jesus knows the timetable he's working to. He knows this will be the last time he will go out to Bethany, and he will enjoy their hospitality and their welcome and their friendship and the good food and all the rest of it. And then he will come back into the city. And his life, that will be, when he comes back into the city, that will be Monday. That will be the Monday of the last week of his life. And so he goes out to have a last meal with his closest friends in the Jerusalem, Bethany area. And when he comes back in, it's sort of a, the cursing of the fig tree. It's been a happy hunting ground for Bible critics and for criticism of Jesus, and all kinds of things are leveled. Well, this is Jesus just being like a spoiled child. He's being petulant and he's being angry and so on. And we're all out of time, so we're not going to deal with that. That was very good, wasn't it? That was like an old trailer from the radio days, wasn't it? The only thing missing was me saying, tune in again next week. Will Dick Tracy escape from the handcuffs? That kind of thing. So we'll pick it up at verse 18 next time, and we'll look at the cursing of the fig tree, and we'll look at Jesus being asked about his authority. By what authority do you do these things? Who gives you the right to do this? It's like somebody saying to you, who do you think you are? Has anyone ever said that to you? Yeah. It's never said in a friendly way, is it? When someone says to you, just who do you think you are? I have been asked that by my wife on occasions, but anyway, we'll gloss over that bit. But we'll pick it up. Has anyone got any questions? Remember, I always urge you to ask the question when it comes to your mind or when we're dealing with that particular verse. If you have a question, please, please, please ask it. No? Okay. I can see you're all eager to get back to pricing collectibles and all kinds of exciting things, so I'll let you go. Thank you so much, everybody.